White House this week explicitly suggested that China's response to the Hong Kong crisis may undermine Sino-U.S. trade talks. How will China respond to this brazen interference in its internal affairs? Speaking of the trade war, U.S. President Donald Trump is already blaming China for any recession that may strike the U.S. economy. But would American voters also blame China or blame President Trump himself? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Last week, when President Donald Trump tweeted, "Of course China wants to make a deal, let them work humanely with Hong Kong first," it wasn't immediately clear if the White House was linking the trade war with Hong Kong's crisis. This week, though, U.S.'s Vice President Mike Pence made it crystal clear. He said it'd be harder for the U.S. to strike a deal if, quote, something violent happens in Hong Kong. Beijing has fired back, telling Washington to mind its own business, that, quote, Hong Kong affairs are purely China's domestic affairs. So why is the Trump administration trying to drag Hong Kong into the trade dispute? And as some Western governments express support for Hong Kong protesters, to what degree, if any, is it going to influence the situation? Joining me for the discussions are from Philadelphia, U.S., Blackburn-Dwyer, president of Grasshopper Strategies, and in our Beijing studio, Qinduo, a senior fellow of the Pangoal Institution, a Beijing-based think tank. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now let's first hear what Vice President Pence said in his address to the Detroit Economic Club on Monday. He urged China to respect the integrity of Hong Kong's laws. He also seemed to warn that Beijing should ensure that protests are not violently suppressed or there would be consequences. Bear in mind that there have been reports that China had readied troops near Hong Kong in the city of Shenzhen on the mainland side. Let's take a listen to what he said.
But for the United States to make a deal with China, Beijing needs to honor its commitments, beginning with the commitment China made in 1984 to respect the integrity of Hong Kong's laws through the Sino-British Joint Declaration.
So there are two things I want to highlight here. First of all, his linking, whether or not he linked how China handles the situation in Hong Kong with the trade war, and secondly, what about the Sino-British Joint Declaration? Let me maybe read a little bit or show a little bit or try to find a little bit what has really been written in the Joint Declaration, which I pointed out, and having read it a couple of times already in the past and having read it again today, I actually couldn't really find any clauses in here which says either any foreign governments have any way to interfere in Hong Kong's domestic affairs, or that seemingly any of the laws that were stipulated in this joint declaration that Hong Kong's residents could enjoy apparently have been breached. For instance, the rights and freedoms to speech, to press, to assembly. Obviously, the fact that these demonstrations have been going on for weeks is a clear demonstration that the right of Hong Kong residents in this regard have actually been upheld. So, Qinduo, starting from the second point, what do you think he meant by that China must respect the integrity of Hong Kong's laws through the Sino-British Joint Declaration?
Well, it's hard to understand why he's making such a statement, because, as you pointed out rightly, China has been basically following, including the Hong Kong government, following all, if you say it's a promise in the 1984 joint statement, it's a promise to Hong Kong people, it's a promise to the Chinese people, and that promise has been kept very well. As you pointed out, if you look at the past weeks for the Hong Kong people are accessing actually their rights to free speech and the rights of demonstration, and so as long as it is peaceful, as long as it is legal, and nobody stopped them from accessing their rights. So why, you might ask, Pence is making such a statement? I'm not sure whether he's qualified to talk about that at all.
By the way, Hong Kong actually ranks higher in the most prestigious index on the rule of law in the world. Hong Kong ranks higher than the United States. It was in the past and it still does in the future. So maybe there is a question to the legitimacy or the qualification of the U.S.'s
right.
High government official in talking about the rule of law in Hong Kong. But I do want to highlight, for instance, this quote from the Sino-British Joint Declaration. For instance, it says that the government of the UK and the government of the people People's Republic of China declare that during the transitional period between the date of entry into force of this joint declaration, which was in 1985, and 30th June 1997, the government of the United Kingdom will be responsible for the administration of Hong Kong with the objective of maintaining and preserving its economic prosperity and social stability, and that the government of the People's Republic of China will give its cooperation in this connection. Basically, this says that Hong Kong will be under the administration of the United Kingdom during that transitional period up to June 1997. After that, it is China's internal affair. So, Brandon, what did I say? What did I read about this law that was difficult to understand? Is it ambiguous to you?
Well, we're very conveniently leaving out the entire section of the 1984 agreement that references respecting laws passed within Hong Kong. And that's when we have to include the basic law of Hong Kong, which is by default effectively the Constitution of Hong Kong. And that was passed in the early 90s. It is that rule of law, that set of laws, that is considered to be integral to the one country, two systems agreement and approach that the Chinese central government agreed to in the 1984 agreement. That agreement was supposed to guide the administration of Hong Kong from 1997 to 2047. And it was only 2 years ago, in 2017, that the central government of China started referring to that agreement as a, quote, historical document, effectively saying, look, we don't really have to agree with it. This is also where the extradition law that had really kicked off a lot of these protests really came into question, because the extradition law effectively created a backdoor, a loophole, where the central government could circumvent the two systems rule by allowing extradition of accused criminals outside of the judicial system of Hong Kong. A pillar of the basic law, a pillar of this two systems concept.
Brenda, I think there is one basic misunderstanding I have to correct before we continue the discussion. The Constitution of Hong Kong is not the basic law. It is the Constitution of China plus the basic law. People seem always have leave out the first part, that they think that the Constitution of Hong Kong is only the basic law of Hong Kong, but actually it is the Constitution of China plus the basic law of Hong Kong. So people always seem to get that wrong there. I don't know where you got your understanding from. And secondly, when you talk about this extradition bill,
first of all, I said by default was the...
Yes, go ahead.
I said by default. I said it was that by default, effectively, in the two systems government, it was by default the so-called constitution. It is not the formal constitution. You're absolutely correct. It is still one country. It is still governed by the central government of China. It is still under the jurisdiction of the administration.
Yeah.
But the two systems concept elevates the basic law to a guiding principle, foundational document that needs to be respected. And it's that respect that international leaders, from Mike Pence to among others, I'm not going to get into Trump on this, but other international leaders are talking about respecting, because it's that basic law that is a foundational principle that would be at the heart of the international agreement signed in 1984 that was both with the people of Hong Kong and with the United Kingdom.
Okay, Qinduo, you would like to respond to this?
Well, if you look at the past records since 1997, the handover of Hong Kong to the sovereignty basically being resumed by the Chinese side. Of course, both Hong Kong government and the Chinese government have been following this one country, two systems strictly. And Brandon mentioned about his extradition bill. The bill has been shelved, which has started, of course, these protests in the first place. And if you look at the bill, the extradition bill is just a part of the common practice between different jurisdictions, between Hong Kong and other entities. So that's why the Hong Kong government is considering this bill to basically make up there's this legal hole in terms of this legal affairs. For example, if there's a murder case happening in Taiwan and then the murderer escaped to Hong Kong, and for Hong Kong government there's nothing they can do, because if you follow their law, it's about where it happened. It's not about who did it. And so they say we need to do something so as to make sure the justice will be done. And I think the purpose is all about legal matters. It is commonly practiced in other parts of the world.
Well, Brendan, this joint declaration is not very long. 3 pieces, 3 pages. If you want, I can read from beginning to end to you, and you will see what I meant, because there is nowhere you can find anything which says that Hong Kong is a completely different country, that it has a completely different, if something happens in Hong Kong that undermines the sovereignty of China, that the central government must stand by idly, or if a serious crime happens in Hong Kong, that there is nothing that the central government or the Hong Kong administration can do to amend these loopholes. There's nothing in there that says that. So I do not know how come when people try to, fill small holes so that criminals who have murdered people, can be brought to justice. Why is that a breach of any system, any country's sovereignty? I think that's quite the opposite, Brendan.
I mean, I would agree. Look, no one is going to sit here and argue that a murderer should be able to run free because of bureaucratic or jurisdictional differences. I mean, we have the same problem in the United States across state lines with murder and extradition. We have the same problems with our autonomous regions. So I completely agree with you. I think the question is that if we only focus there, it's a little bit short-sighted. The concern that people have with the new extradition law, which I understand has been suspended, by the way, not shelved. Suspended means that it can come back at any point in time.
Well, the chief executive said it's dead.
It doesn't mean that it's been scrapped forever.
The chief executive said
it's dead in the water. But from
do you
a legal
know
perspective,
how many things that come back to life after it's been proclaimed dead? And by the way, it was dead not because it was a wrong bill.
I think that
it was dead because people couldn't understand it. They didn't do a very good job communicating with the people. People were not ready for it. That's why it was done in a way that people couldn't understand and couldn't accept it for the moment, but not because there was a bad bill per se, Brandon.
Okay. No, and I agree. And I think that part of the reason it was a bad bill, I'll use your language, I wasn't going to go that far, but a bad bill was that it was a little bit short-sighted. The way it was written, the way it was worded, really opened the door to a lot of concerns for people inside Hong Kong and for people that are observers of Hong Kong. Because the way the bill was written, it wasn't just targeted at murderers or extreme crimes. It was open door for mainland authorities, central authorities, police, to operate inside Hong Kong as part of a cooperation agreement.
No.
The separation or the ability of Hong Kong to administer its own laws has been central to Hong Kong since 1997. That short-sighted aspect to it focused simply on the murder case, not on what was really a broader concern for the local people.
It never said that mainland police would go into Hong Kong and capture people and bring them back to the mainland. It said the Hong Kong government, the Hong Kong judicial system will make their cases whether they want to hand over anybody, and there are a lot of preconditions as to what kind of suspects, what kind of cases can be dealt under this kind of bill. I think there are a lot of nuances that are left out there. Qinduo.
Absolutely. For example, in order to actually relieve the concern, there are 7 instances that will never be handed over back to the mainland. For example, when it comes to possible political prosecution, or freedom, religious freedom, or freedom of speech, or academic freedom, etc. The 7 cases, and also 11 cases actually. And also, if it also raised the threshold for any criminal cases that deserves a punishment up to 7 and above years of imprisonment. So it's not for minor issues, it's for serious issues like murder. So I think there's it's like a fallacy, a popular misunderstanding for people. I understand the concern. I think there's a legitimate concern. I think the government should have done a better job at communicating with the public, with the people. But remember, it was shelved. It's dead. So the demonstration right now is much more than that. If you look at the violence, attacking the police station, attacking the police force, and storming the legislative council, and also defacement of the national emblem, it's much more than that.
I set out to want to talk about, why the United States is trying to link how China handles the situation in Hong Kong to the trade war. Brandon, what's your opinion there? Do you think it's a smart move? Do you think it's a move that is in the interest of the United States, or it's a move that makes any sense to you?
Well, there's three interpretations, each of ascending reasonableness, okay? The least reasonable is that President Trump has a history of taking anything that he can get a headline on and using it to bash any opponent over the head with. So in that sense, he's going to latch onto this because he's just been very anti-China recently. That's not helpful. We also have the second issue about, I think Mike Pence is warning and a couple other people that if there were broad-scale crackdown violence, something very extensively tragic in Hong Kong, it would complicate public opinion on any agreement. That's absolutely true. Doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It's true it would happen. The third is, at a baseline, if the public or if other leaders deem changes in Hong Kong to contravene the basic law of Hong Kong or the 1984 agreement, it would raise long-standing questions about China's commitment to long-term trade agreements or international agreements. Now, I think that's a little overblown, and I do think that the Trump administration is using that simply for pressure tactics. I'm not sure it's very helpful in this situation, but that's the most reasonable concern being expressed by some of the more reasonable leaders we have around the world, and has some validity just because, again, like my colleague and both of you have raised, that there hasn't been very good communication around the extradition law, that the conflict between the government and the protesters has not been very well handled publicly, internally, et cetera, from a communications perspective.
I think a lot of people would disagree whether President Mike Pence or U.S. President Donald Trump belong to the more reasonable leaders in the world, but that's a totally different argument.
I didn't say that they did. Definitely did not say that they did.
Okay, just wanted to make sure that I didn't hear the wrong thing. Qinduo, what's the Chinese perspective on this? Now that the U.S. has expressed in such a very clear way that, if you don't do this on Hong Kong, or if you did something on Hong Kong that way, you are not going to get the trade deal.
I think the Chinese side rightly feel upset about that. Firstly, there's the condescending attitudes. When we talk about the basic law or the joint declaration, whatever promise the Chinese government has made under the basic law, it's a promise that's said to the Chinese people, to the Hong Kong people. It's not a promise made to Washington or to London, first of all, clarification. And also because Hong Kong is the internal affairs of China. Hong Kong is a part of China.
If something really goes, if the situation really goes out of control, China will probably have to do something, and this is common sense for every country, right?
And it's really up to the central government. It's China's affairs, whether China handled it in the best way or in the less, probably than the ideal way, but it's really China's affair. If they handled it good, that's all, everything is well. If it's handled poorly, that's China's problem.
And China will suffer the consequences as
exactly.
well.
Secondly, it's, when, Mike Pence is talking about this violence, the issue is like when there's a field with violence, nobody condemned from the Western government. Are they bland, the violence of storming into the legislature?
No, actually, U.S. congressional leader encouraged, saying that it was a beautiful sight to behold.
So this is, I would say, outrageous for a lot of Chinese people.
I wouldn't say Ms. Pelosi specifically encouraged riots, but she didn't condemn any violence, and she encouraged protesters even after extreme violence took place. So I think that is very ambiguous message to send when to say that the protests are a beautiful sight to behold. So clearly, I would imagine some people will feel emboldened, right, when people are not punishing you or condemning you for your violence, but saying go ahead and do more.
That's you can see that kind of statement, remarks is an effort to glorify the protesters' violent behavior. So that is very problematic. At the same time, there's a demonization of the police force in Hong Kong.
All right, all right. Brandon, do you want to say something real quick before I go?
Just that Nancy Pelosi is a long time a critic of China. She never encouraged violence, but she did praise the protesters. She comes from a very liberal, anti-mainland China segment of the country in her district. And at the end of the day, everyone wants to see a peaceful resolution here. Everyone. It will help everything. It will help faith in China. It will help faith in Hong Kong's economy. It will help faith in building towards a deal. And that's the goal for everyone at the end of the day.
Okay. Thank you so much, Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer of Grasshopper Strategies and Qinduo of the Pangoal Institution.